clicked it, and we're live. It is Tuesday, July 6th, 5:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Daylight, whatever. It's just 5. And we're not allowed to have fun anymore. But Scott has the monologue.
Yeah, I would just say, let me just say that Ben, who we all love, makes fun of Kate for the technical stuff, you know, like hitting the go live button and various other things. I just want you to know, it is so unbelievably complicated. It's easier to launch the space shuttle than to like run the show. And I would just say that she took me through it today, like for an hour and a half, and I still don't know what I'm doing. But I want to say I am in awe of you, Kate, of your technical abilities, and in the next time Ben goes after you for this, I'm canceling him. I'm just going to cancel him.
Oh my God,
yeah.
Thank you, Scott. It was I would just say that you are a very I liked teaching you tech because you, like me, create a framework of, like, I don't know where Massimo just went, but hopefully he'll come back in a second. Oh yeah, he's here. Wait, maybe. Oh no, he took his video off on purpose. Okay, I'll bring him back in a second. But I was just gonna say that, like, you create a framework of understanding and a system for understanding what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it, rather than just like memorizing rote steps. And I respect that because that is how everything ever makes sense to me.
Because the thing is, what you did actually fit into a framework, whereas as opposed to other things like long division where there's no rhyme or reason. Is Massimo going to come back?
I think so. I'm going to check on him. Is he back?
Okay.
Yes, I'm
there
here.
He is. Okay.
Hi. I shut down my air conditioning because I thought that was generating a background noise, but it was not. I still hear background noise.
Oh no, it's not. It is 100%. Listen to this. It's Scott.
Okay then, we found the culprit.
Right. Yeah, no, it isn't. But please do not sweat your face off, Massimo. We would like you to be comfortable if you need to have your... I couldn't hear air conditioning at all over Scott's...
Okay. Well then, give me a second. Give me a second, and I'll be back.
Okay.
Okay. I will. You know what? I turned my my microphone up last time because people said it was too low. And so now I'm going to turn it back down.
Wait, can we do something actually? So are you connected on your Bluetooth or to your headphones right now?
Yes.
So can we try something as long as we're just sitting here? Go up to the screen. This is toggle mic. It's like a little microphone at the top of your face in the Crowdcast thing.
Oh, yes. Yeah, what should I
And
do?
click on that little button. Oh no, is that, wait, so that, hold on, does that...
I think that just mutes.
Maybe that just mutes. Sorry, I mean toggle studio sound. That's the one that I meant. Oh, okay. We just murdered Scott. We just wiped him off the face of the planet. Oh, that's better actually. Okay.
Oh, really? Okay, great. Okay.
Okay. Let me bring back in Massimo.
Here I am.
Hello.
All right.
Can we just jump in? Because there's so many questions.
Let's
why
get
don't
started.
we introduce him?
Oh, I'm
Sure.
sorry.
Really
Go ahead.
Oh, no, am I introducing him? Do you want to introduce him?
I am Massimo.
Yeah.
Oh, Massimo, how do you pronounce your last name? Can I ask you that?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's pronounced Pigliucci. The G is almost silent. The GL sound,
Pigliucci.
Lieu is almost impossible for Americans, so go silent. Yep, that's good.
Pigliucci.
Yep.
Okay. Massimo Pigliucci, you are at the City College of New York, a professor of philosophy, and you're here in particular to speak to us today, and we're really excited about it, about kind of the field guide to how basically oh my gosh, what is the word that I forgot to capitalize today?
Happy life?
The Stoics.
Yeah, sorry, happy life.
Oh
yeah. So that one. Anyways.
That one.
Thank you so much for coming. That was the most awkward thing ever. Welcome to this show.
Well, the reason why I didn't think he needed an introduction is because there was like an enormous grassroots groundswell for Massimo to come on, and so therefore we were like, absolutely, and we waited. You had a lot of things to do in the last month and a half, and we're really really grateful that you decided to come on. First of all, I want to say, like, reading your background, you have the most incredibly interesting background. So if I
oh my god, you have 2 PhDs?
No, 3.
Yeah, unfortunately.
It's kind
of embarrassing.
For the love of God, have you ever made money, man?
Good point. Yeah.
That's like one more PhD than on the screw. So like you're crushing us. How did that happen?
It happened for a number of reasons. The short story is I got my doctorate, really, which is equivalent to a PhD in Italy, in genetics at the University of Ferrara. And then I was looking for a postdoc, and I figured that I wanted an experience abroad. So I started looking at people this was in biology, and I evolutionary biology in particular. And I started looking at people that I found interesting. And I did get a postdoc offer at McGill, but I really wanted to go work with a guy named Carl Schlichting at the University of Connecticut, who is still there, in fact, and we're friends now. And Carl, however, just freshly appointed assistant professor, no money, no grants, nothing. So forget the postdoc. But he said, you could come here and do a PhD instead. I said, well, would I want to do a PhD instead since I already got one? It's like, well, we're going to give you a little bit more money. You're going to teach less. You're going to do whatever you want in terms of research. If you want to stay in the United States, probably an American degree is going to have. Okay, so fine. That sounds like a good idea. It was an excellent idea, as it turns out, because during those 4 years, I was Carl's first and for most of that time only student. By the time we were done, we had co-written a book and published 17 papers, which in terms of biological research is a lot. So that was the first one. And then I did my...
It's a lot in many other fields
yeah,
too.
Probably.
Yeah, right.
Probably. And, but that's the advantage when you get into something that you know already how to do, and you have clear ideas and all that sort of stuff. So then I started my academic career, did an actual postdoc at Brown, and then I was hired as a faculty at the University of Tennessee first, and then I moved to Stony Brook University. And at some point, midlife crisis hit, and I decided that I wanted to do something different. It also happened that when I was still at Tennessee, I met this guy, Jonathan Kaplan, who is now a full professor in philosophy at Oregon State University. And Jonathan had just finished his dissertation at Stanford, where he was looking at issues, philosophical issues surrounding and ethical issues surrounding gene-environment interactions or nature-nurture. That happened to be what I was doing as a biologist. So he knew my work, he looked me up. We had coffee and we hit it well. We became friends. We started collaborating. We wrote papers together. And then one day I said, Jonathan, sounds like it would be a good idea for me in the next phase to sort of move toward philosophy, because I'm more and more interested in this kind of stuff. But I want to do it seriously. I don't want to do the scientist who plays philosopher. I actually want a degree in philosophy. So how about I sign up for the PhD program here and you be my mentor. Now, please notice that at that time I was a full professor and he was a young assistant professor without tenure. So he looked at me and he said, how many glasses of wine did you have today? And I said, I don't drink at lunch.
It's 10 o'clock in the morning and I don't drink until 7 p.m.
It's lunchtime, so it's like 6. 6 is okay. And so one thing led to another. We went to the dean and we got permission to do this bizarre thing where I was running the lab during the day and then going across campus and taking classes in the evening. And 3.5 years later, I defended my dissertation. That was the third one. And I still remained in biology for 5 more years. But then, again, as part of this ongoing, slowly unfolding midlife crisis, I decided that enough of this living in so-called suburban paradise in different places in the United States. I really wanted to live in a real city, so I needed to move to New York. And I moved to New York, but my job was still at Stony Brook, so that's a kind of a grueling commute, 2 hours by train one way. So it's like not gonna. So I started looking for a job in New York, and I said, look, at this point, whatever comes first. If it is a job in biology, fine. If it is in philosophy, fine. And the first job that came out was at City University of New York, and they were looking for a philosopher. And it was a position as a department chair. So I started out as a department chair, which was a nightmare for me. But it's like, okay, that's the devil's bargain. If I want to move to philosophy, that's what's going to happen. So that's the story.
That's amazing. Can I just say one thing?
Can I just tell you one really quick, So
sure.
In America, we have this tradition of having midlife crises where people buy Ferraris.
Right.
You might have heard of Ferrari. They get
Right.
made.
Right. Yeah. No, in my case, it would have been. A Lamborghini, because I think they're even better than Ferraris, and it would have been orange because I have actually seen orange Lamborghinis. The problem is I couldn't afford it, so.
Because the no money thing.
Right. Yeah, I was going to suggest starting an internet show because that's how. How I've been participated in one. That's how I've been dealing with it. But so let's I would love I want to hear we have, unfortunately, I would say we have an extremely happy audience. So
that is unfortunate. Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but first of all, I'd love to know how you got into the Stoics. I mean, it sounds like you didn't work on the Stoics, but number two, like how'd you get into it, and and you don't have to answer this now, but before we go, I want you to tell us some takeaways.
It's part of the same story, actually. I mentioned the midlife crisis, etc. That was not just a career crisis. It was, a couple of other things happened. Unexpected divorce, my father dying, all of that in the same year. Now, again, nothing extraordinary, but something at some point you can stop and you say, okay, what am I doing? What is my frame of reference here and all that? And since I had left the Catholic Church when I was a teenager, my frame of reference had been secular humanism. But when I reached out to secular humanism as a way to sort of deal with, day-to-day problems, issues, the setbacks and all that sort of stuff, I found that there was not much there. There was no practice. There was no practical advice. There was a lot of interesting ideas that I still subscribe to, but nothing that was actually helpful on an immediate basis. So I figured, okay, well, you have a degree in philosophy, you might want to look into philosophy. Maybe there is an answer somewhere. And so I systematically went through a number of practical philosophies, starting with Buddhism. And then eventually I figured out pretty quickly that the answer, for me at least, was going to come from somewhere in the ballpark of virtue ethics. So then the next step was Aristotle. And then after that, it was Epicurus. And all of those were very interesting, but none of them kind of clicked. And one day I was on Twitter and I saw this tweet that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I said, the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because, I thought the Stoics are these people who, like Mr. Spock from Star Trek, suppressing emotions and stiff upper lip and all that sort of stuff. And I figured, despite the fact that Spock is my favorite character, you can see me as Spock right here.
That's awesome. Wow.
One of my graduate students gave this to me. But despite that, it's like, no, that doesn't seem like something to celebrate. But I was curious because I immediately remember, it's like, wait a minute, but the Stoics, that's Marcus Aurelius. And I read the Meditations in college and I kind of liked it. And that's also Seneca. And wait a minute, I translated Seneca from Latin when I was in high school. But I never actually put the two together. Like, oh, they were talking about the same stuff? That's interesting. So I signed up and I said, okay, let me see what this thing is about. And the first thing that they had me do, the organization that is called Modern Stoicism had me do, was to download materials about a Stoic that I'd never heard of, Epictetus. And it turns out Epictetus was actually a household name up until the 19th century. I mean, one of his books, the Enchiridion, was in the personal libraries of almost all of the founding fathers of the United States: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. But these days, very few people have heard of Epictetus unless you have been interested in Stoicism. So I started reading Epictetus, and he talks about some of his friends who got politically involved in ancient Rome against the tyranny of Vespasian and Nero and got sent into exile or killed as a result. I said, okay, this is pretty heavy stuff. And then he follows up by saying, well, but the fact is, my friends, it doesn't look like today I'm going to die. So it looks like it's the time for lunch. Let's go and take care of lunch. And then we'll think about dying later. I said, what is this guy? He's talking about these really interesting things, very heavy subjects, and then he uses this kind of sense of humor that borders on sarcasm. He's no nonsense. I was hooked, and that was it. That's how I started.
So one of the things you wrote in the book was that his name actually translates to the acquired, because he started as a slave, I think, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that, hearing that your background, you did study nature versus nurture, how much of his philosophy or your opinions on his philosophy are influenced by our own nature versus nurture? Because so much of it is self-governance. And
yeah. Oh, that's an excellent question, particularly because the Stoics actually had a fairly sophisticated, for the time, theory of what we would today call moral developmental psychology. So they thought that human beings are by nature capable of, by nature identified as a species or characterized as a species by two things. By our ability to reason, obviously, which doesn't mean that we're reasonable all the time or even most of the time, but we are capable of reasoning to a far larger extent than any other known species. And we're highly social. And so they thought that human beings are basically born with a tendency toward what they call virtue, and we would today call pro-social nature or collaborative nature, which is true. This is something that now modern evolutionary biologists and comparative anthropologists have pretty much confirmed. And in fact, we're one of a number of species of primates that are born with instincts that are pro-social. But in our case, according to the Stoics, what happens is that you start out with sort of an instinctual propensity to collaborate with people, to cooperate with people, to bond with people. Of course, usually your caretakers, your immediate, the people that are immediately around you. But then when we hit the age of reason, beginning at 7 or 8 years old, when we start being capable of more abstract and general thinking, we start realizing that there are other people that are just like us, that have the same needs, the same wants, and so on and so forth. And that is the beginning of what a philosopher would call ethics. And so it really is a nice combination of nature and nurture. We tend to behave pro-socially in part because we have a strong social instinct as animals, as primates, but also in part because we think about stuff and we say, well, yeah, that guy on the other side of the room is not my parent, is not my sibling or anything like that, but he looks a lot like me, he behaves a lot like me, he feels probably a lot like me, so it's right to behave in a certain way toward him.
So I love all of this. It's really similar. Actually, I don't have like 3 PhDs, I have 1, but I do have a JD. And I did strongly consider 2 PhDs, to be fair. One was going to be in cognitive psychology, and in fact I just ended up doing my PhD in law and kind of stacking a bunch of cognitive psychologists onto my committee, so I got around it that way. So when I was at Brown, I studied with Steve Sloan, who I don't know if you were there, but he was in the cognitive science department. And one of the things that I came out of, I would say that when I was in college was I graduated in 2006 and I finished, and I was very much in this phase of wanting, neurolaw was this very big thing. fMRIs were this very big thing. Right. And there's been a number of philosophers and cognitive scientists and cognitive philosophers or cognitive psychologists who have kind of blurred this line for me between philosophy and empirics, and I don't know, Jack Balkin at Yale used to explain to me, like, Kate, like, it used to be that science was the handmaiden of philosophy, and now, like, philosophy is the handmaiden of science, or maybe it was the other way around, whatever. And like, I'm not sure what the handmaiden is doing in that scenario, but basically, I do think that there is a really interesting, one of the very interesting things that I kind of find is if you dig down deep enough into this nature-nurture debate, into kind of a cognitive framework, that you just kind of start getting to a place in which the only answers that you can create and put onto a biological system are going to come from some type of self-possessed structure that you can like project onto this,
Yeah.
like onto this thing, and that is philosophy. And so the thing that I find really confusing is, like, I don't know personally, and I'm wondering if you have any, how come I hated philosophy when I was like taking philosophy? Like, why did it all just seem like pontificating, like, kind of nonsense when I was taking existentialism, when I was taking kind of like, you know, and why when you take Platonic ideals and you structure it into a Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky kind of like similarity paper, does that make perfect sense to me? But
Right.
It doesn't make any sense to me as a philosophy kind of question.
I don't want to
Is it just
offend
about
any
the discipline.
No, I don't want to offend anybody, but my first guess at least, is going to be bad teachers. I tend to blame when people tell me that they dislike either philosophy or science, because just as many people tell me, "Oh, I can't stand science classes and all that." I tend to blame the teachers. In my case, it happened the other way around. When I was in high school in Italy, I had to take 3 years of philosophy. And my teacher was wonderful. She really, made the subject come alive. And the same when I went to college, one of my most influential professors was my professor of paleontology, with whom we're still friends now. And they made the field come alive. So I tend to blame teachers for that sort of stuff, not the field itself. Because you can teach things in a way that makes people see those connections and makes them excited about things, or you can just, as my professor of paleontology used to say, you can teach paleontology as if it were the Yellow Pages, and that's not exciting. It's like one thing after another.
No,
but it's interesting. You mentioned, these connections between fields, and the fact that it makes more sense once things make more sense once that you start thinking both philosophically and empirically. And one of the reasons I was struck by the prescient attitude of the Stoics is because that was exactly their approach. They thought that in order to live a good life, learn how to live a good life, which was the field of ethics as they understood it. In antiquity, ethics was understood not just as the study of right and wrong, but the study of literally how to live your life. So it's much broader. They said, you also need two other things. You need to study logic, in the broad sense of good reasoning. They would include cognitive science, for instance, in logic. The study of people biases and things like that. Why? Well, because if you don't reason correctly about things, how are you going to figure out how to live your life? And you had to study what they call physics, from the Greek physis, which really meant natural science today, right? Meant nature. So you need to study natural science and metaphysics. Why? Because if you don't understand how the world works, you're also likely to make mistakes in your life, right? So those three things go together from the beginning. The ethics is informed both by good reasoning and by empirical evidence.
I love that. Thank you.
Can I? First of all, I'm really jealous how clear you are. But I'm going to put that.
Scott, you are also this clear. You are really good at explaining.
That's what I hear. It's like, yeah. But anyway,
not like that. But I would say so. Since I would love to hear like 2 or 3 kind of main lessons that you take away from Epictetus or the Stoics about how to live a good life for for us, for the members of the audience, and
Yeah.
then also I would love just to hear, like, whether, like, what that meant to you during the pandemic.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So let's start with what is sometimes referred to as the dichotomy of control. This notion that as Epictetus puts it right at the beginning of the Enchiridion, his manual, he says some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. And then he makes a list of these two things, which I'll get to in a minute. And then he basically says the good life consists in focusing on the first group, the things that are up to you, and trying to develop an attitude of equanimity toward the things that are not up to you. Now, this thought, it is definitely Stoic, meaning that not only it's found in Epictetus, who was one of the late Stoics actually, but it goes all the way to the beginning of the school in the late 5th century BCE in Athens. The founder of the school was Zeno of Citium, not to be confused with Zeno of the Paradox. That's a different Zeno. But the same exact idea is found in a number of other traditions. For instance, it shows up in 8th century Buddhism, in 11th century Judaism, and in 20th century Christianity. A lot of people have heard of the Serenity Prayer, which is used often at the beginning of meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, the Serenity Prayer asks God the wisdom to tell the difference between what you can change and what you cannot change, but also the courage to change what you can, and the serenity to accept what you cannot change. Well, that's essentially Epictetus' advice. He says, look, you have to figure out he doesn't ask God, he says you have to use your reason to figure out, based on your understanding of the world, of the empirical evidence from the world, what things are up to you, where your agency is maximized, and what things are not up to you, where your agency is either irrelevant or is minimized. And then you focus on the first ones, and then and develop this attitude of equanimity toward the second one. Equanimity in this case meaning acceptance if there is nothing you can do about it, right? That doesn't mean that you have to joyfully embrace, let's say, disaster or setbacks, but if there's nothing you can do about it, you might as well accept it rather than make things worse by invoking the gods and telling them that why did they do this kind of thing to you. It's not just about you, it's the rest of the world works in the same way. So the dichotomy of control is fundamental to Stoicism, and it has been very useful for me in practice on a number of occasions. For instance, let me give you one of the latest iterations. With my wife, before we just moved here in Brooklyn Heights, we were still in Brooklyn, like 3 blocks away, but we were renting. And middle of pandemic, of course, so mostly at home. And one nice day, the refrigerator breaks down. So it's like, well, that's not good, because that now means that not only we cannot get fresh produce, store fresh produce and so on and so forth, but it also means that we will have to go to the market more often, thereby exposing ourselves to the possibility of being infected. This was at the height of the pandemic in New York. So that was not a good thing. Well, immediately, both of us sort of snapped into the dichotomy of control mode. It's like, okay, so what is up to us here? Well, the first thing is to call the building and say, can we replace the refrigerator? Can we order a new refrigerator to be replaced, to be sent immediately? And they said, no, we don't accept the delivery of large appliances in the middle of the pandemic. Fine. Then the second point was, well, maybe we can get a smaller thing. So we asked again, can we get a small refrigerator, like, college dorm kind of stuff? And the answer was yes. Excellent. Then let's get on the web and find, a good refrigerator, dorm style refrigerator. We got that part, but that of course took several days to come in. So in the meantime, what are we going to do? Well, let's organize our diet for the next few days. Let's go to foods like pasta and beans as opposed to perishable stuff. There was not a moment of panic. There was not a moment of, say, damn thing and all that sort of stuff. It is what it is. You have a problem. Focus on the bits of your problem that you can address, that you can either solve or at least improve, and accept with equanimity what? Well, you have to accept with equanimity that even with a small refrigerator, now you still have to go to the supermarket more often than not. It means that your diet is going to be different for the next several weeks and so on and so forth. Well, you just take it for what it is and go on. Now, that's a simple example, but these kind of things happen all the time. And of course, there are also larger examples. In an earlier book that I wrote about Stoicism, how to be a Stoic. I told the story of the situation where I was in my home and I was cutting some bread, and unfortunately I cut the bread with a blunted knife. Never do that, because the knife slips and it basically cut off this finger almost all the way down to the bone. It's like, that's
I've
not
done like
good.
that 3 times in the past year.
Exactly.
Cool.
So I was like, well, now what? Right? Again, what is up to me here? To hold the thing as firmly as possible so that there's little blood, and to just walk downstairs, however I was in my slippers, and walk a couple of blocks to the emergency room. Fortunately for me, it was nearby, and see what they can do. And I went there, and the first thing that the person told me was behind the counter was like, well, all the doctors are in a meeting right now. And I said, yeah. You realize that I'm dripping blood on your desk, right? So one of those doctors has to come out of the meeting. And that happened, and they fixed the thing. And although I still I had not recovered entirely the sensitivity from the tip of the finger, it was resolved as as well as you can. So again, the general idea is, hey, stuff happens. Setbacks will happen. Stuff that you don't like will happen. And your only choice is to either deal with it on its own terms and trying to do the best that you can, or just waste your energy emotionally and otherwise, just asking yourself, why do these things happen to people like you? But that's not going to do much good. So that's one example of a Stoic concept that I think is very useful. Another big one, for me at least, is the so-called 4 cardinal virtues. The Stoics believe that there are character traits, and that some of these character traits are particularly important. These behavioral tendencies, what they call virtues, are particularly important. The top 4 ones are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Practical wisdom is the knowledge of what is really good and what is not good. If you don't have that, or if you don't work on that, you're in trouble, because you're going to make all sorts of mistakes. Courage is not bravery in the battlefield. It's moral courage. It's the courage to do the right thing. Justice is treating other people, fairly, in a way in which you would want to be treated, with dignity, etc. And then temperance is doing things in, right measure. So the Stoics go around basically life by using these 4 virtues as if they were a compass, a moral compass. And anything you do, from the minor things to the major ones, you're supposed to ask yourself, well, how does it go with the 4 virtues? For instance, let's say that I go back to work, after a pandemic, or when the pandemic is a better situation, and I see my boss, who is actually a really nice guy, harassing a coworker. Well, what do? I consult the 4 cardinal virtues. The practical wisdom tells me that the right thing to do is to intervene, because that's just it's a good thing. It's a good application of my character. It's a good application of who I am. Courage tells me it will require a little bit of courage, because it's my boss. There could be, retaliation. There could be awkward situations and things like that. So it will require courage. Is it just? Yes, because if that were happening to me, I would want somebody to step in and sort of try to diffuse the situation. What about temperance? Well, temperance tells me that I want to do things in the right measure. That means I can't just whisper something under my breath so that I'm not heard by my boss, because that's not enough. But at the same time, I'm not going to jump up and start punching on his nose, because that's too much of a reaction given the situation. So I'm going to simply firmly and calmly try to get in and see and try to diffuse the situation. So that's how an actual application of Stoicism works. And the idea is that the more you do this, the more you ask yourself, well, in this situation, how would the 4 virtues direct me? Which way would I go? The more it becomes automatic. It's like learning to drive a car. Initially, you kind of had to pay attention to everything, right? Because you're freaking out. Oh, the person is crossing the street. The other car is passing me. Where is the brake and all that? But quickly enough, you actually, this becomes second nature. And so it becomes automatic. You immediately start thinking in terms of the dichotomy of control, or the 4 virtues, or other useful techniques.
So I just want to say that, like, I actually, like, I completely, also my grandfather, it turns out, was a Stoic, because he would just, like, cut off half his finger and then be like, butterfly Band-Aid. Like every time, butterfly Band-Aid fixed everything. No one needs stitches ever. Just a butterfly Band-Aid. But I will say that, like, I would put it a different way. That, like, you do this over and over. There are two things, and I'll phrase what you said in a slightly different way, which is like the Danny Kahneman kind of thinking fast and slow two system theory, which is like you're overcoming something. You're overcoming like an impulse to panic when you see blood, an impulse to freak out when you have like you're faced with your entire food supply like changing. And you're talking about basically training yourself to a system 2 response of basically having a rational response to something, and you're talking about doing it enough times so you have pattern recognition, so you can like sense over time, having enough pattern, like being in enough shitty situations to be able to sort them quickly into the really shitty ones and like the really shitty ones and like the I won't remember this in 2 weeks, but I'll freak out about it right now type of like. And like I think that this is fair. I think most people do not do this, but but you like phrased it in terms of like the virtues, which I would never call on to like talk about this. I would call on like cognizant, but we're saying the exact same thing, and I completely live my life that way, and it's been transformative. How you dealt with like the lack of refrigerator, everything, like I do all of that. It's been transformative. We are like my partner and I don't really fight. Like we really don't get freaked out about a lot of stuff. Like I just like I don't know. Like it is a much calmer way of like going through life.
That's right. And Epictetus of course had not read. Great. Epictetus of course had not read Kahneman. But if he had, he would have wholeheartedly agreed. There is a bit in the Discourses where he says, look, whenever you have an impression is, for a Stoic, is the first automatic judgment that you tend to have about certain things. Whenever you have an impression, you have to slow down and inquire with the impression, who are you and what you represent and what should I do with you? So he's essentially telling you to slow down, to shift from what we call system 1 to system 2. Of course, if you can do it, if you have the time to do it. I mean, sometimes you do have to make a decision on this on the snap on the moment. But the other thing that Epictetus also is very clear about is that the way to achieve good Stoic practice is to do this so many times and to have it so frequently come to your mind that it does become automatic. He doesn't use the word automatic, but he basically says it will come to you immediately. It is not by chance, I think, that Stoicism strongly influenced early cognitive behavioral therapy. Because a lot of the early CBT practitioners, Albert Ellis and Beck and so on and so forth, they actually read the Stoics and they thought, hey, these people were onto something. Of course, the Stoics were onto something not on the basis of systematic empirical evidence, experiments, etc. They were just good observers of human behavior, and they had good intuitions about human behavior. Today, we can certainly refine things and doing it better, but it's essentially the same concept.
Let me.
That makes me feel better.
Let me get real for a second.
Sure.
Okay. Why isn't Stoicism victim blaming? So let me give you an example, right? So one of the things you talk a lot about in the field guide, which I really recommend, I put the link up in the chat.
Thank you.
About one of the things about what you can control your own attitudes, but you can't control other people's attitudes towards you. But it's also true, the Stoics felt, which is true, that we're social creatures, and those two things seem to be very much in tension. So I want to read to you something that came to mind when I was actually, I have it as an audiobook when I was listening to it. And this is from the majority opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court upheld separate versus equal public accommodations. And this is what the court says: we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with the badge of inferiority. If this be so, It is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction on it. Now, that feels like something that a Stoic would say to a group that, you're just in a, who cares what other people think of you? The only thing that should matter is what you think. And, and it feels like that somehow misses how social creatures live in the world. And I was curious what you thought about that.
No, that's a great question. Thanks for asking it, because that's a major problem that comes up almost every time that I talk about Stoicism. So there are some misunderstandings and misapplications of Stoicism today that kind of very much follow along the lines that you're talking about. I refer to one of them as Silicon Valley Stoicism. When people tell me that people like Jeff Bezos is a Stoic because he uses certain techniques to, get more and more billions out of squeezing billions and billions out of his poor employees. It's like, no, that's not Stoicism. Although the techniques, I'm sure they work, but it's not Stoicism, and I'll explain why in a minute. The other one is what I refer to as Broicism, as in bro. This is basically the men's rights movement, and stuff like that, where they say, oh, it's all about being tough and who cares what other people think? It's my thing, etc. So this is so much not Stoicism that I am constantly baffled by why so many people take that to be Stoicism. And the reason it isn't is this. First of all of the Stoics, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, all of them, constantly telling you that we're social animals and that the major goal in the life of a Stoic should be to help the human cosmopolis, that is, the big family of humanity. Marcus Aurelius says that repeatedly in the Meditations, over and over and over. So the good life for a Stoic is a life where you actually use reason in order to improve social living. So it isn't about you at all, or it is not about, it's about you only insofar as you are a member of a broader community. Marcus Aurelius goes on and says very clearly, it's like, do only and exclusively what social reason demands of you. That's it. That's as far as he's concerned, the major thing that he needs to do in life is to be helpful to other people, which, by the way, he was in a number of occurrences. So that's one reason why I tend to be kind of baffled by that. But the other thing is, well, the other criticism, related criticism that Stoicism, that is also often raised to Stoicism is, but fine, the techniques are helpful in terms of dealing with, setbacks and all that stuff. But a lot of the problems that we have in society are structural. And so, if you keep telling people, certain things are the way they are and you can't change them, that is in effect either blaming the victim or at the very least not doing anything in particular to help the victim, right? But that too is strange to me, because even a cursory reading of Stoic philosophy and especially Stoic history shows that is definitely not the way these people worked. There is a group of ancient senators and philosophers referred to as the Stoic Opposition. These were people who fought against what they considered the tyranny of Nero, Vespasian, and Domitian, three of the Roman emperors of the time. These people risked their lives, and they often lost their life. Or they were sent into exile, which was, the next worst things that could happen to an ancient Roman, precisely because they thought that the system of government that they were under was not right, and these were privileged people. These were senators. This was the aristocracy, right? So these are privileged people who said, no, this is not good. This is not acceptable. This is not the way to go, and they were willing to risk their life in order to make the case that things should change. So it is true, of course, that a Stoic will say, look, you can curve a life worth living, which is the Stoic translation of eudaimonia, of the Greek eudaimonia, a life worth living, even under the worst possible circumstances. Because if you cannot change the circumstances, there is still going to be something you can do in order to be helpful, not just to yourself, but to others. Let me give you an example, a specific example. Nelson Mandela. So we all know the story, so I don't have to sort of get into details. But perhaps a number of people don't know that one of the turning points in Mandela's career was when he was in prison, and he was, of course, understandably angered and filled with hatred for the apartheid government, for his captors, and so on and so forth. And yet, at some point, one of his fellow inmates smuggled in a copy of the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And Mandela claims that was one of the turning points. It wasn't the only factor, of course, but it was a turning point because he saw that there was another way. There was a way of reaching out, of understanding that people do bad things because they don't know better, which is the Socratic attitude, basically. The Stoics got that from Socrates, that even bad people, evil people, whatever it is, they always do what they think is right. And so fundamentally, it's a mistake that they're making. They're in error, and therefore they can be reached, and at least potentially, and they can be redeemed, or at least they can come. You can make them see the other side, which is exactly what Nelson Mandela did. Right? He reached out to his captors, to his jailer, and he made it a policy from that point on of setting aside anger and hatred, as justified as they may have been, and trying to reach out, to build consensus, to remind himself that even his jailer was still a human being, that probably had a family and children and so on and so forth, and that probably in his mind was doing the right thing. That's not an argument for moral relativism, by the way, but it is an argument for understanding and compassion even when people go wrong. It's not very different from the Christian attitude, right?
So one of the things that I've always struggled with, particularly through the lens of role ethics, is that you still have this seemingly natural law that defines a good, and the Stoics don't necessarily ascribe to that, if I remembering correctly. And it's very difficult for me because when you're going about converting someone through your own self-meditation and the role that you're in, and you're using the position that you're in to your opinion, how do you really know that you're converting them to the correct opinion or what is the good? And so it's something I always struggle with, because moral relativism, as you've referenced, is kind of what triggered this for me. And
no, that's a great question. So Stoicism, just like virtue ethics in general, is a kind of naturalistic ethics. So there are three major, stepping back for a second here, there are three major ways of thinking about ethics, essentially, in philosophy. One is realism. That is, there are such a thing as moral truths. And even if you don't know them, you don't understand them, or you don't get it, they're there. It's ethics treated as if it were mathematics or logic. And Kant was probably the most important exponent of that kind of approach. Then there is relativism. No, I'm sorry. Anything goes because your opinion is different from mine, and it's all cultural, it's all local, it all depends on how you grew up. Even though the relativist position is actually very popular, I don't know anybody who actually lives as a relativist. When something is done wrong to him or her, they do get upset. They don't say, oh, well, it was his opinion. The third view, which in my mind is the most promising, and as I said, Stoicism is an example of it, but not the only one, is ethical naturalism. One of the best modern exponents of ethical naturalism is Philippa Foot, who wrote a number of books on this, including Natural Goodness. And ethical naturalism basically tells you that ethics is the result of two components. On the one hand, our nature as cooperative, we were talking about this before, our nature as cooperative social beings, which brings us, other things being equal, to be cooperative and to be pro-social. And to, most of the times, by default, we like other people and we like to interact with other people in a constructive fashion. Plus, the reasoning part that extends that instinctual cooperation that we have with kins and close relatives and friends and things like that, and it tells us, yeah, but wait a minute, the rest of the world is made of similar kinds of beings, and so you should at least strive to consider them in the same way. So naturalistic ethics kind of strikes a balance between these two opposite positions. It tells you that yes, there is a lot of variation between different cultures, but the variation is found mostly about things that are not actually that important. There's no culture that condones murder understood as unjustified or random killing. Nobody, no culture does that. Comparative psychologists and anthropologists have actually found a number of moral rules that are essentially universal across human societies. And there is a reason for that, because if you violate those rules systematically, you just don't have a society. Right. If you start allowing people to kill or steal or whatever it is all they want, you're just not going to have a society. Then there are, however, rules that are not universal, and those are the ones that we can actually have a discussion about, and we can actually say, well, maybe it might work this way or might not work. But ethical naturalism, I think, is a really nice compromise. And as I said, all of virtue ethics, which, by the way, it's not just a Western tradition. Like Confucianism, for instance, is an example of virtue ethics in the Eastern traditions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amy has two good questions. Amy, thank you for holding on and waiting. Nice to see you. Can you, your most upvoted question was kind of, let's just do that one since we're kind of running out of time, although your second question is also wonderful. But I think we've kind of delved into it a little bit at this point. So go ahead and just ask your question about character after adulthood.
Sure. Hi, Massimo.
Hi, Amy.
And happy birthday, Kate.
Thanks.
So my upvoted question, welcome to our show. This is the show that saved me over the pandemic, Massimo.
That's a good function right there.
This is the group that saved me. So do you think it's possible for humans to change their character after adulthood? Or
Yes.
do you think after a certain point, character is baked in?
No, it is possible. It is possible, and in fact, we have empirical evidence that it is possible. That doesn't mean it's easy, of course. It does require work, but it is certainly possible. I can give you the personal anecdotal example, and then I can get into a little bit more of a systematic overview. As many people, I've done early on in my life the battery of tests that determines the 5 big personalities, which is one of the standard and best empirically based personality tests in psychology. And as it turns out, the last time I have a record of the last time that I did it, that was just a few months before I started practicing Stoicism. And that was very convenient, because then 6 years later, I did it again. And my psychologist friend said, you're not going to find any difference, because these things tend to be stable over time. Turns out my psychologist friends were wrong. First of all, actually, the literature does show that your scores on the Big Five can change and do change throughout your life, although usually not a lot, and usually, as I said, it requires a concerted effort. Mine went through the roof. They really, some of them changed in dramatic fashion, and of course, who knows exactly? This is not a controlled experiment, so I'm sure that other than my Stoic practice, there were other factors. For instance, I'm getting older, and presumably a little bit more experience, and so on and so forth. But then I was curious about this, and so I looked into the actual psychological literature, and it turns out that there is actually pretty good evidence that what we refer to as character is in fact significantly changeable through time. But as I said, if you want to improve your character, meaning if you want to become more generous or more courageous in a moral sense, and so on and so forth, you have to practice. And the Stoics were actually very clear about this. Nothing is going to happen just because you wish to become better, and certainly nothing is going to happen just because you get older, or at least nothing significant is going to happen. You don't get wiser by getting older. You get wiser by getting older and paying attention to what has happened to you, by reflecting on your experiences, especially critical self-reflection. Now, one of the things that can happen at this point, however, is like, yes, but modern psychology also tells us that it's very easy for human beings to rationalize. So what is stopping me from rationalizing all these things and convincing myself that I got a better and better at certain things? But in fact, it's all in my mind. So it's like doesn't actually correspond to reality. The Stoics thought that personal self-reflection is very important, but it's not the only thing you need to do in order to become a better person. There are two other things that they suggested, two, maybe even three. One is pick good friends. Pick what Aristotle called friends of virtue, right? The kind of friend that not only listens to you, but actually calls you out and says, "No, my friend, I think you're rationalizing this thing. Yeah, I think you're really, trying to carve out an excuse for yourself." So the kind of friend that is not afraid of actually helping you out, even though there is some criticism there that might be necessary. Another technique that the Stoics use very much, and it is in fact also validated by modern empirical evidence, is what I call the sage on the shoulder. The sage on the shoulder is this notion that you pick a role model and you imagine that role model is sitting right here on your shoulder and doing everything you do, and you ask yourself, so what would Socrates have done under these kind of conditions, right? Lots of people do that. A lot of Christians that I know have these bracelets that say WWJD, what would Jesus do, right? And the notion there is that you want to compare yourself to some kind of, as Seneca has this nice image, he says, the only way you find out that you're still crooked is if you compare yourself to a straight ruler, right? And so you pick a role model who doesn't have to be a perfect person. One of my favorite role models, for instance, is my grandfather, who passed away a number of years ago, but he was one of the best people I've ever known in my life. And so I often ask myself, well, what would my grandpa do about this kind of situation? How would he address the situation? So those are all different techniques that you can use, but the notion is self-improvement is possible, but it requires work. And in fact, Epictetus said this is a work that should start immediately and never ends. It should start immediately because, as he puts it colorfully, he says, the Olympic Games have already started and you're already behind. So what are you waiting for? He didn't believe in New Year's resolutions, right? Because so let's say that you understand that quit smoking or going to the gym is good for you, and it's now mid-October, let's say, and you say, well, January 1st, I'm going to do that. Well, if you understand that those are good things for you, what the hell are you waiting for January 1st? The Olympic Games is already started. You're already behind, so get started now.
That sounds like it sounds like the complete opposite of the Augustine thing about Lord, give me continence, but not now. Sorry. Right. This is like complete opposite. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Kate. Sorry.
We have Mike Godwin to ask the last question. Mike.
Hi. Can you hear me? See me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Hi, friend.
So I'm going to make this really short since we're running out of time, and change my question entirely to make it short. Thank you, by the way, Massimo and your colleagues for rescuing the demarcation problem, which I care. Look, I care a lot about this problem. I really care a lot about it, and it's on top of all my Karl Popper books, so that's exactly where it belongs.
Yep.
But I want the larger project, I think, of Popper's, and I think you saved a valuable thing that Popper did in terms of philosophy of science, which was identifying the problem. But the larger issue that I want to ask you about is critical rationalism. There's the larger idea that you have this, that your knowledge or your theory of the world is provisional, that it's subject to being refuted, and how this informs how you build institutions. It's what, to my surprise later in life, after having read his philosophy of science, I read The Open Society and realized it was all kind of connected, which was hugely, hugely exciting. And you can imagine that during the Trump administration, I've thought a lot about designing institutions and democratic societies so that they survive when the worst people are in charge, rather than assume that the best people will be in charge. But the critical rationalism stuff, I think, is really hugely practical, even though it's philosophy of science. My personal belief has been that it's hugely practical as an ethical approach for an individual to just always have this idea that your cherished notion may be refuted. The thing that you are, your eternal verities may not be eternal. And I wondered if you thought that bit of Popper was also either had been rescued or can be rescued, because I think it's just, I'm not a scientist. I've done science, but I'm not a scientist. But I've just found it incredibly helpful in my life and work.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is quite a shift from the Stoic stuff that we were on, but it is an interesting question. Yeah, my second passion other than Stoicism is what I've actually been hired to do at City College, which is philosophy of science. And with my background in as an actual working scientist, I thought that these ideas were coming together really, really nicely. Yes, there is a lot that needs to be rescued in Popper. One of these days, if I had enough time, I would probably sit down and write a book about this thing, but we'll see. Because Popper is much misunderstood. I mean, like every other thinker, there are things that he said that don't stand up to further scrutiny. That's just, that goes for pretty much everyone. But I fear that these days, especially several in the science departments, they take the Wikipedia version of Popper, or actually even that would be actually a step forward, and just run with it. Unfortunately, a lot of my colleagues in the sciences, if you ask them anything about philosophy of science, they will mention two names, Popper and Kuhn, and very likely they've never read either one of them. And I will bet you $1 to donut that they misquote or misunderstand them. Just one small anecdote. A few years ago, I was invited in Munich, in Germany, to a conference on string theory, physics. And I responded to I replied to the organizer. I said, there must be a mistake. I'm neither a physicist nor a philosopher of physics, so I don't know why the hell are you inviting me here. By the way, this was a big conference, Nobel Prizes, level kind of stuff. And the guy said, no mistake. The problem is there is a huge discussion within fundamental physics between pro-string theory and anti-string theory, and these people are throwing Popper at each other. And the guy said, and I suspect that they actually don't know what they're talking about, despite their Nobel Prizes. Therefore, I would like a philosopher to actually come in and gives us right at the beginning of the conference a Popper 101, so that then we get that out of the way. And it was fascinating. I accepted. And it was a fascinating experience, because here you are with all these physicists who are working on really cool stuff, and they were listening to me giving them a basic lecture that I give, introductory classes in philosophy of science on Popper. That did change the tone of the discussion throughout the rest of the conference. First of all, I noticed that nobody dared bringing up Popper after my talk, because they understood that they just really didn't know what they're talking about. And which, if you ask me to talk about string theory, if you ask me to talk about
internet law conferences,
yeah, right. So I mean, just because you're Nobel Prize, unfortunately, it doesn't mean, or fortunately maybe, it doesn't mean that you can talk about anything with understanding and with depth. And so this was a very interesting experience. But yes, the general answer to the question is Popper does need a reevaluation. A lot of the stuff that he wrote, especially in the Open Society, is still very much germane today, and I think is also very practical. It has practical implications. Yeah.
Okay, but that was such a fun hour. Can you come back, please? And can we just talk about everything that we just started to talk about? That last question, that was incredible. I feel like we just got to know you, and now you're leaving. And anyways, well, we can do this again, which is the nice part about doing this so often.
Yeah.
But
no, it was a pleasure, and
thanks
for having me. That was great. Thank you.
We will be back 22 hours and 52 minutes from now. And it will be with Will Codrington, my good friend and a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. He went to Brown with me, and now he does election and political science work and con law at Brooklyn Law School. And so that will be 22 hours and 52 minutes from now. And until then, Scott, we don't have fun anymore.
But I was going to sing happy birthday to you, but I was told by GDF that Ben sang it to you last time.
Yeah, he did.
He did. Okay, so I won't do it.
We're good.
But we can't have fun anymore, but we can control the things over which we can change. And for that unbelievably important lesson, we thank you so much, Massimo. Thank you so much for coming. We would love to have you back.
All right.
I'm gonna put Massimo's book again in the chat, and it will be there for everyone. And Massimo, come on again soon. It
Anytime.
was a complete treat.
Thank you,
Anytime.
Massimo.
Thank you.
And very happy
Bye-bye.
birthday, Kate.
Happy
Yeah,
birthday.
happy
Kate.
birthday,